My name is Dr. Natalie Reyes. I'm 31 years old, and the morning my supervising attending stood in front of the residency committee and told 9 people that I had made a clinical error that had nearly cost a patient his life, I was sitting 3 chairs to his left with a USB drive in my pocket that contained every order, every timestamp, every note, and every communication from that night, organized in a 47-page document that I had been building for 6 weeks while he assumed I was too afraid of losing my residency to say a single word. He was wrong about a lot of things. He was most wrong about that. I let him finish his statement. I watched the committee absorb it. I watched the faces of people who had known me for 3 years recalibrate in real time around the story he was telling. And I sat with my hands folded on the table and I thought about the patient in room 14, about the night that had started all of this, about the 6 weeks I had spent building something so complete and so accurate that what was about to happen in that room was not going to be a defense, it was going to be a demolition. I asked if I could respond. The committee chair nodded, and I placed the USB drive on the table. If you have ever been blamed for something you didn't do by someone who had the power to make everyone believe them, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because this story is about what happens when the person they underestimated spent every spare hour building the case that would change everything, and it is just getting started. I knew I wanted to be a doctor at age 9, not because of a dramatic moment or a family tragedy, because of a Tuesday afternoon in a clinic waiting room in Tucson, Arizona, where I watched a physician named Dr. Carmen Solis explain a diagnosis to my grandmother with the particular patience of someone who understood that information was not enough, that understanding required time and repetition and the willingness to sit with a frightened person until the fear became something manageable. I watched my grandmother's face change during that conversation, watched the fear reorganize itself into something she could hold, and I thought, that is what I want to do. I want to be the person in that room who changes what fear feels like. I was the first person in my family to go to college, the first to go to medical school. I got into my program at 23 on my 3rd application cycle because the first 2 cycles I had been rejected, and I had spent those 2 years working as a medical assistant and studying and applying again without telling anyone except my mother because I couldn't afford the weight of other people's expectations on top of my own. When I got in, my mother cried for 20 minutes and then made tamales and called everyone she knew, and I sat in her kitchen feeling something so large I didn't have a name for it yet. Medical school was 4 years of the particular endurance sport of learning an enormous amount of material under conditions of chronic sleep deprivation while also learning to be a functional human being in a clinical environment. I was good at it, not because I was the smartest person in my class but because I was the most willing to sit with uncertainty and keep working. Because I had grown up in a household where giving up was not a vocabulary that existed, and because every time it got hard, I thought about my grandmother's face in that clinic and remembered what it was all for. I matched into internal medicine residency at a program in Chicago, a strong program, competitive, the kind of place that produced good physicians through a combination of excellent training and the particular pressure of being expected to perform at a high level in a high-stakes environment. I arrived at 31 years old, 3 years into residency, with a reputation for being thorough, calm under pressure, and the kind of resident who stayed late not because she was slow but because she was making sure everything was done correctly before she left. My supervising attending was Dr. Richard Calloway. He was 53 years old, 22 years in practice, the kind of physician who had once been excellent and now coasted on the reputation that excellence had built. He was not a bad doctor exactly, but he was a tired one, a man who had stopped being curious about the work sometime in the previous decade and had replaced curiosity with authority. He knew more than his residents, and he expected that differential to excuse him from the effort of explaining his reasoning. We were there to execute his decisions, not to understand them. I had been on his service for 4 months when the night happened. The patient was a 58-year-old man named Mr. Gerald Hoffman. He had come in through the ED with chest pain and shortness of breath. A workup that evening suggested a pulmonary embolism. He was started on anticoagulation and admitted to our service for monitoring and management. I was his primary resident, which meant I was the one writing the orders, the one checking in through the night, the one responsible for the granular management of his care under Calloway's supervision. At 2:47 in the morning, Mr. Hoffman's oxygen saturation dropped. I was at his bedside within 4 minutes. I assessed him. I called Calloway. I described what I was seeing with the specificity I had been trained to use. Saturations in the low 80s, increased work of breathing, altered mental status. I told Calloway I was concerned about a complication and described what I thought was happening. Calloway told me to increase the oxygen and monitor closely. He did not come in. He did not ask me to call a rapid response. He told me to increase the oxygen and monitor closely, and he went back to sleep. I increased the oxygen. I monitored closely. I documented everything with timestamps because documenting everything with timestamps was what I did on every patient every night, because I had learned early in residency that the medical record was the only objective account of what actually happened in a room at 2 in the morning. I called Calloway again at 3:15 when the situation had not improved. I described the deterioration in specific terms. I recommended escalating care. Calloway told me I was being anxious, that the patient was stable enough, that I should adjust the anticoagulation dosing and check back in an hour. I adjusted the anticoagulation dosing. I documented the conversation. I documented his instruction. I documented my concern. I stayed at Mr. Hoffman's bedside for the next 40 minutes, and at 3:52 I made a decision. I called the rapid response myself. The rapid response team came. They assessed Mr. Hoffman. They moved him to the ICU. It was the right call. The intensivist who took over his care told me the following morning that the escalation had been timely and appropriate and that Mr. Hoffman was going to be okay. I went home at 6 in the morning. I slept for 4 hours. I came back and checked on Mr. Hoffman, and he was improving, and I felt the particular exhaustion of a difficult night resolved correctly. I did not yet know what Calloway was doing while I slept. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later when the residency program director, Dr. Ann Foster, called me into her office with the particular tone of someone about to say something difficult. She told me that a concern had been raised about my management of Mr. Hoffman, that Calloway had submitted a report indicating that I had made an independent medication adjustment without adequate supervision that had contributed to a complication requiring ICU transfer. She told me this calmly and carefully and watched my face while she said it. I sat in that chair and felt something I want to describe accurately because it matters. It was not panic. It was not even primarily anger. It was a cold and clarifying recognition. The recognition of someone who has just understood the shape of a situation that had been forming for longer than she realized. I asked Dr. Foster if I could have 24 hours before responding formally. She said yes. And I went home and I opened my laptop and I pulled up every piece of documentation from that night and I started reading it in sequence from the beginning. The medical record was complete. Every timestamp, every note, every order, every call log. The 2 calls to Calloway at 2:47 and 3:15, his instructions documented in my notes, my documentation of his response, the timeline of Mr. Hoffman's deterioration, my decision to call the rapid response, the intensivist's assessment, all of it there, all of it timestamped, all of it in my handwriting and under my credentials, a complete and objective account of exactly what had happened in that room. What the record also showed, when I looked at it carefully, was what Calloway had not documented. He had not written a note for either of my calls to him. He had not documented his instructions to me. He had not documented his assessment of the situation from home at 2:47 in the morning or at 3:15. The only note he had written was a brief addendum added 2 days after the event that described, in vague and carefully worded language, a concern about the resident's independent decision-making. 2 days after, I looked at that timestamp for a long time. He had written his version of events 2 days after they happened, after Mr. Hoffman had been transferred to the ICU, after it was clear that an escalation of care had been necessary and that someone was going to have to account for why it had taken until 3:52 to happen, and he had written a note that placed the decision-making in my hands and the delay in my judgment. I opened a new document and I started building. The 6 weeks between that evening and the committee meeting were the most precise 6 weeks of my life. I worked on the document the way I worked on everything that mattered, methodically and without rushing. I pulled the complete medical record for Mr. Hoffman's admission, every order, every note, every vital sign trend, every medication administration record. I pulled the call logs from the nursing station that showed the times I had called the on-call line for Callaway's answering service. I wrote a timeline that placed every event in sequence with its corresponding documentation. And I identified every gap, every missing note, every timestamp that told a story Callaway had not intended to tell. I called my cousin Adriana, who was an attorney in Phoenix specializing in employment and professional liability. I trusted her completely, and she was the only person outside the hospital I told any of this to. She listened to everything and asked questions that were sharp and specific, and at the end she said, "Natalie, you documented this the way someone documents something they knew might matter later." And I said, "I document everything that way, every night, every patient." And she said, "I know, that's exactly why you're going to be okay." She walked me through what the committee process looked like, what my rights were, what I could and could not present. She reviewed the document I was building and made suggestions about structure and framing. She was methodical and calm, and I understood for the first time in 6 weeks that I was not alone in this. I also did something else during those 6 weeks, something I want to be careful about describing because it matters how it happened and why. I talked to the other residents on Callaway's service, not about my situation. I just listened. I asked how things were going. I paid attention to the particular way people talked around certain subjects, the hesitations, the careful phrasings, the things that were almost said and then redirected, and what I heard, over several weeks of careful listening, was that I was not the first person to have been in a difficult position on Callaway's service at 2 a.m. and been left to manage it alone. I did not ask anyone to come forward. I did not suggest that they had anything to share. I simply listened, and I filed what I heard, and I let people make their own decisions. 3 days before the committee meeting, 2 other residents, a second year named James Park and a third year named Sophia Mendez, separately and without knowing about each other, went to Dr. Foster's office and asked to submit statements about their experiences on Callaway's service, Dr. Foster called me that evening to tell me, and I thanked her and sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up, thinking about a Tuesday afternoon in a clinic waiting room in Tucson, about the reason any of us were in this at all. The committee meeting was a Thursday morning in March, 9 people around a conference table, Callaway at one end, me 3 chairs to his left, Dr. Foster in the center, and 7 other attending physicians and program leadership whose faces I had been learning to read for 3 years. I knew who among them was fair and who was political and who was afraid of conflict and who had been in medicine long enough to know that what happened at 2 a.m. on a difficult service was rarely as simple as one person's account of it. Callaway spoke for 12 minutes. His statement was polished and specific in the way of something that had been prepared carefully. He described a resident who had made an independent medication adjustment outside the scope of her supervision, who had escalated a situation that could have been managed conservatively, whose anxiety had driven a decision that disrupted the patient's care and required intensive resources that may not have been necessary. He was measured and authoritative, and he did not look at me once while he spoke. I watched the committee absorb it. I watched the faces. I watched Dr. Foster, who was watching me. When he finished, I asked if I could respond, and the committee chair nodded, and I placed the USB drive on the table and I said, "I'd like to walk the committee through the complete medical record for Mr. Hoffman's admission, including the call logs, the nursing documentation, and the time-stamped notes from the night in question. I have printed copies for everyone at the table and a digital version on the drive." I handed out the 4 to 7 page document. I gave everyone a moment to orient themselves to the structure, and then I walked them through it from the beginning, not quickly, not defensively, the way I had been trained to present a case, clearly and in sequence, letting the record speak for what it contained. I walked them through the 2 calls to Callaway, the timestamps on the call log, the documentation of his instructions in my notes written in real time that night. I walked them through his addendum written 48 hours after the fact. I placed it beside my notes from the same period and let the committee see the difference between documentation written in the moment and documentation written 2 days later, with the benefit of knowing how the story had ended. I walked them through Mr. Hoffman's vital sign trends, showing the trajectory that had informed my decision to call the rapid response. I presented the intensivist's assessment from the following morning describing the escalation as timely and appropriate. I showed them the gap in Calloway's documentation for the 2 phone calls he had received and the instructions he had given. I spoke for 22 minutes, and I did not raise my voice once. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that had followed Calloway's statement. It was the quiet of people recalibrating, of the committee understanding that they were looking at 2 very different kinds of accounts, one constructed and one contemporaneous, one that had gaps where there should have been documentation and one that had a timestamp for everything. Dr. Foster asked Calloway if he wanted to respond to the documentation I had presented. He said several things, none of which addressed the gaps, and I watched his authority reorganize itself into something smaller in real time. The committee went into deliberation, and I went to the hospital cafeteria and bought a coffee I didn't drink and sat at a table by the window and watched the March morning outside and thought about Mr. Hoffman in the ICU, recovering, going to be okay, and I thought about the 9-year-old in the clinic waiting room in Tucson, and I thought, you did the right thing that night and you did the right thing this morning, whatever happens next. The committee issued its findings 2 weeks later. The incident was determined to have been managed appropriately by the resident on service. The decision to call a rapid response was found to be clinically sound and timely. The documentation practices of the supervising attending were flagged for review. Calloway was placed on a supervision improvement plan, which in the language of hospital administration meant that people were watching him now in a way they had not been watching him before, and that the residents on his service were going to have a different experience going forward. I was cleared completely. My record was clean. I received a letter from Dr. Foster that described my documentation practices as exemplary and my conduct throughout the process as professional. I folded that letter and put it in the same drawer where I kept my acceptance letter to medical school and my grandmother's recipe for tamales, things that belong together. James Park and Sofia Mendez both received formal acknowledgement that their statements had been heard and that the concerns they raised were being addressed. James told me afterward that he had been sitting on his experience for 8 months and hadn't known what to do with it. I told him that sometimes the only thing you can do is wait until the moment is right and then say the true thing clearly. He nodded and said he was going to remember that. Calloway finished the academic year on modified supervision and took an early retirement the following summer. The program hired 2 new attendings to cover his service, both of them younger and more engaged and the kind of physicians who answered their phones at 2:47 in the morning without making their residents feel like a burden for calling. Mr. Hoffman sent a card to the residency program in April. I don't know if he knew my name specifically, but the card said thank you to the team that took care of me and to whoever made the call that night to escalate my care. I asked Dr. Foster if I could keep a copy of it, and she said of course, and I put it in the drawer with the other things. I am still in residency, 18 months from finishing. I am going to be an excellent physician not because everything has been easy, but because the hard things taught me something that no lecture or textbook could have. They taught me that the medical record is not paperwork. It is the truth of what happened in a room at 2 in the morning when nobody was watching. It is the account that exists when memory is fallible and authority is loud, and the easiest thing would be to let someone else's version of events become the official one. Document everything, not because you expect to need it, because you respect what you do enough to leave an accurate record of it, because the patients whose care you are responsible for deserve a record that tells the truth, because someday someone is going to need to know exactly what happened and you want to be the person who can show them. If you are somewhere right now being blamed for something you didn't do by someone who has the power to make it stick, I want you to hear this clearly. Authority is loud, but documentation is permanent. The person with the title can construct a narrative, but they cannot alter a timestamp. They cannot retroactively write a note they didn't write. They cannot undo what the record already contains. Your job is to make sure the record is complete. Your job is to document in real time. Your job is to be so thorough that when the moment comes, the truth is already in the room waiting, and all you have to do is hand it to the people who need to see it. You do not have to be loud. You do not have to perform outrage. You do not have to make a scene. You just have to be more careful than the person who underestimated you, and in my experience that is almost never very difficult. My name is Dr. Natalie Reyes. I'm 31 years old. And I became a doctor because of a Tuesday afternoon in a clinic waiting room in Tucson, where I watched a physician change what fear felt like for a frightened woman. I have not forgotten that, not for a single day, and I am not going to let anyone take it from me. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And if no one has told you lately that being thorough is not a small thing, I'm telling you now.